Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Foundations and its subsets for both Historic and Timeless. So Foundations is going to be the next set that drops on Arena, and that's going to be standard legal, so that's going to be legal across the board. But we're also getting Foundations Jumpstart alongside it, which is kind of an extra set that's going to be legal in Historic and Timeless. And we're also, as usual, going to be getting some special guests as well, which is kind of like an extra 10 or so cards that's going to be legal in Historic and Timeless as well. So in this video, I've basically gone through all three of those sets and pulled out any cards that I think are likely to see play in Historic and Timeless, starting off with the cards that I think are more likely to have an immediate impact, and then moving more towards the fringe stuff as we go. Also, for any MTG Zone Premium members, I put up a new article yesterday that's a very big deep dive on 6 Theory Craft deck lists that I've built around these new cards, and I'm very excited for this set. I think, most sets that have come out since Modern Horizons 3, there's a handful of cards there that could have impact in Tier 2 or maybe Tier 1 decks in both formats, but I think this particular set actually has a decent number of cards that I do think have could potentially birth either new variants or brand new Tier 1 decks in both formats potentially. So if you want to see my take on those decks, definitely check the article out. I'll have a link to that down in the description. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. So starting off here with two cards that I think are going to have the biggest impact in Historic and could also potentially have an impact in Timeless as well. We'll have to see. But we're getting Seat of the Synod and Vault of Whispers in this set, which is absolutely huge for Affinity. So obviously Affinity has been around in Historic for quite a while now. And even though it did get Kappa Cannoneer in Modern Horizons 3, it hasn't really seen any play at all, just because the support cards for Kappa Cannoneer aren't really good enough for it to be able to compete. And I think Seat of the Synod and Vault of Whispers are really going to speed up the Affinity decks to the point where the proactive game plan of those decks should be able to compete with the other Tier 1 decks in the format right now. So obviously we do have some artifact lands on Arena already. We've got Darksteel Citadel and the full cycle of tap lands as well, but they both come with pretty significant downsides. Darksteel Citadel not tapping for coloured mana, and the tap lands obviously interrupting your curve means that it really does add a layer of inconsistency to your mana base. And also I think one of the main reasons why a lot of Affinity decks in the past have chosen to not even run Darksteel Citadel as a full play set is because there weren't really that many payoffs for running it, right? Obviously Thought Monitor is the biggest one. Being able to discount that quickly is really, really important, but outside of that, the only real bonus to running artifact lands is to buff your Ingenious Smith or slightly buff your Nettle Cyst. Kappa Cannoneer, for example, doesn't really benefit from the artifact lands because it has Improvise rather than Affinity, so it doesn't actually help you accelerate into that. But another card that we're getting in Jumpstart, or in the Foundations set here, is Thoughtcast as well. And this is a card I've been wanting on Arena for a really long time. And now you can run 4 Thoughtcast, 4 Thought Monitors. So not only does these OG artifact lands kind of fix the issues that we had with previous artifact lands where these produce the colour of mana that you need, they enter play untapped, so you can run the full 8 copies, which means you're going to have some hands where you draw this in multiples and can discount your Affinity cards really quickly. But we now have way more payoffs for doing so as well. So I'm really excited to run decks with Seat of the Synod, Vault of Whispers, Thoughtcast, Thought Monitor, and Kappa Cannoneer. It feels now like the deck should have a ton of extra payoffs and just really accelerate your starts as well, which is a pretty big deal as well. Now, I would have preferred to have the white one over the black one, if I'm honest, because I think white does have better, cheaper artifacts like Esper Sentinel and Portable Hole, for example, but black does have some cards. Blood Fountain in particular is basically a 1-mana card that produces 2 artifacts, which if you're running the full 4 copies of Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor, that's a really big deal. So I think this deck, the big issue that I had with Affinity ever since Historic got such a big power creep from Modern Horizons 3 is just the support cards to accelerate into it weren't good enough. Now with these artifact lands and Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor, I think the deck should accelerate a ton, and I think it should be able to compete again. I wouldn't be surprised if Affinity becomes the top tier deck with the release of these artifact lands. Now, obviously the big issue with running a deck with 8 artifact lands in is that it makes you very, very vulnerable to Divine Purge and Wrath of the Skies, because they not only sweep away all of your artifacts and creatures, but they also get rid of your lands as well, which is a very big deal. But I think this is a deck that wants to be main decking 4 Metallic Rebuke anyway, so that gives you some counterplay game 1, and presumably you'll be a blue-black deck as well, so post-sideboard you get access to Thoughtseize if you wanted a sideboard card that also has applications in other matchups like against Auras, for example, and if not, if you wanted to target those sweepers specifically, you could obviously run Spell Pierce or Miscast as well. So I'm so excited for this, and I would be very surprised if Affinity isn't significantly better with these additions. Then in terms of Timeless, the Affinity decks haven't really seen any play in Timeless. I just, like I said, if the support cards aren't good enough for Historic, the deck isn't going to be fast enough for Timeless. I do think the deck is going to be getting a lot better, or a lot more viable in Timeless, but I think the big issue moving there is the format in general is a lot faster, and also if you are running the full 4 copies of Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor, you make the deck a lot more vulnerable to Orcish Bowmasters, which isn't really a thing in Historic at all. And then I don't think you really have good main deck counterplay to that other than Metallic Rebuke, right? Black artifacts don't really have good removal, right? You don't have Portable Hole, so I don't know whether you'd want to be main decking Fatal Push, which doesn't really synergize well with what you want to be doing. I really feel like if you're running 4 Thought Monitor, 4 Thoughtcast, 4 Kappa Cannoneer, you really want the rest of your deck to just be cheap artifacts and Metallic Rebuke as your only non-artifact, so I don't know how you really have good counterplay to Bowmasters, for example, so I wouldn't be surprised if this doesn't see play in Timeless, but I think this is going to be an absolute top-tier contender in Historic, and I'm really excited to play with this. Then next up we got Balustrade Spy, which unlocks a very interesting combo in both Historic and Timeless, but I'm particularly excited for this one in Timeless. So, if you're not familiar with how this works, basically you want to be running Balustrade Spy in a deck where your entire mana base is made up of modal double-face lands from Zendikar Rising and Modern Horizons 3, so you basically have no actual lands in your deck. So when you cast Balustrade Spy and target yourself, you mill over your entire deck, and then I think the best way to win from there is using either Reanimate or Unearth if you're playing Historic to bring back Thassa's Oracle and win the game on the spot. So the key combo pieces you need here, obviously Balustrade Spy, Reanimate or Unearth depending on which format you're playing, Thassa's Oracle, Jack-o'-lantern and Turn the Earth. So the way this works is you mill your whole deck, and then during your upkeep the following turn, you activate Jack-o'-lantern to produce a green mana, flashback Turn the Earth from your graveyard to put Reanimate or Unearth on top of your deck, and then as long as you've got your third land there, or if you've already got a third land in play, you just cast Reanimate or Unearth to bring back Thassa's Oracle from the graveyard and win the game on the spot. So the reason I'm particularly excited about this one in Timeless is because I think this package slots very well into the Orzhov Belcher deck that's emerged recently. I believe it was pioneered by Greaseball, so shouts out to them. But I think this could be an upgrade over Sorin plus Elenda in that deck, because first of all, you only need to find one card, right? For Sorin plus Elenda, you need to get 2 of them together, which is a lot more difficult to do in terms of consistency. So this, you only need Ritual into Balustrade Spy or Sacrifice into Balustrade Spy, which should improve consistency there for one. Secondly, I think the big weakness of the current Orzhov Belcher list is that they're very vulnerable to Disruptor Flute. Disruptor Flute shuts off all of their top end, whether that's Necropotent, Sorin, or Belcher as well, whereas Balustrade Spy just doesn't care about Disruptor Flute at all. So one of your 2 main win conditions not getting shut off by Disruptor Flute feels like a very big deal there as well. And then additionally, it should also increase your ability to kill on turn 1 as well, because if you're able to produce 5 mana on turn 1, you can potentially win on turn 1 by going maybe Evoke Solitude, Sacrifice, produce 5 mana, cast Balustrade Spy, mill your entire deck, and then if you've got Reanimate in your hand, you can just Reanimate Thassa's Oracle there to win on turn 1, and then similarly you can go Dark Ritual, Balustrade Spy, mill your whole deck, Reanimate Thassa's Oracle. And I think in this deck you want to be running 4 copies of Reanimate anyway, because it also works very well with Grief or Solitude, which is a huge deal. Now it does come with some downsides. First of all, it makes the deck somewhat vulnerable to Graveyard Hate where it wasn't previously, and additionally it also means you can't run Necro Dominance because it shuts off your own graveyard as well. So there definitely are some, it's not a clear-cut improvement, but I really feel like it should be an improvement because of the consistency, making the deck more resilient, and increasing your range of turn 1 kills, which is very big in a deck that can mulligan aggressively as well, which is a pretty big deal. Then in terms of Historic, I do think that this could be played alongside Belcher there as well. Now obviously you do lack the rituals like Dark Ritual and Sacrifice, which makes the deck slower, but you could obviously just run black-red or black-green and just run cards like Strike It Rich or some other green ramp in order to accelerate into this. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is playable in Historic as well, but this just feels like a really good slot into one of the best Timeless decks already. So very excited to try it out, and honestly I'm a little bit concerned that this does enable more turn 1 kills, which I don't think is particularly healthy for for Timeless, but I think this is going to be very powerful for sure. The next up we got Priest of Gix, which is another card that I think is likely to have an impact in both Historic and Timeless, specifically in the Jetstorm deck. So this is really nice in Jetstorm because it just opens up a bunch of new combo lines. For example, if you can get this alongside Chthonian Nightmare and Jet Medallion, you just have infinite mana, and then that deck obviously wants to be running a bunch of tutor effects like Diabolic Intent or Demonic Tutor, so all you need to do is just run a one-of that can win with infinite mana, like a Torment of Hailfire or something, so you just make infinite mana, Diabolic Intent, sacrificing the Priest of Gix, and then just Torment of Hailfire for the win. You can also win with a Marionette Apprentice or Meathook Massacre without needing Jet Medallion if you have Priest of Gix plus the Shambling Ghast or a Greedy Freebooter, because every time you loop a Priest of Gix and one of those two cards, you get 3 mana off this and a treasure token off the Shambling Ghast or Freebooter, which pays 4 mana for the 2 times that you need to cast Chthonian Nightmare, so that's another combo win. And the other nice thing about this is that it also just synergizes well with a lot of the other cards in the deck, so it turns into a ritual with Jet Medallion, bring it back with Chthonian Nightmare also produces a bunch of mana as well, which is very good with your tutor effects, because then you can tutor, find something expensive, and then cast that. So Priest of Gix just seems like it slots very well into Jetstorm. Now, Jetstorm hasn't been that good in Historic, or I haven't really found a good way to convert it there, but this card giving you access to redundancy for more combo lines, and like I said, just synergizing well with a lot of cards that the deck already wants to be running, makes me feel like it should also make the deck more viable than Historic as well. So very excited to return and try Jetstorm again with Priest of Gix. Then next up we got Goblin Bushwhacker. So this card is in the special guest if you're trying to figure out which set it's from, and this is a card I've been wanting them to add to Arena for a really long time, and I'm so glad they did. And I'm mainly excited for this card in Boros Convoke in Historic. So that's been a deck that it's been pretty powerful, but it hasn't really seen much play in a while, and I think it's just it lacked a little bit of consistency in its ability to race. Now, obviously, with Gleeful Demolition and Kuldotha Rebirth, you could very consistently set up that turn 2 Convoke, which is very powerful, but the format has sped up a lot since that deck was popular, and I feel like the big issue with it was that convoking in a Knight Errant Evios rather than a Venerated Loxodon often felt like you were taking your foot off the gas a little bit, and Convoke is a deck that is all about just racing. If you're not able to race, you really struggle to win in long games in a lot of situations, and so in previous builds, you didn't really have a good target to find off Knight Errant Evios. Now, we did have Imodane's Recruiter, but that being 3 mana is such an issue in a deck where you really want to keep the land count low, and you oftentimes don't have access to your 3rd land, so it would be uncastable in a lot of situations. Now, the addition of Ruby Collector was a big buff to that, because that does give you a target to be able to go turn 2, convoke Knight Errant Evios, find a Ruby Collector, play it, and then activate it. But again, you still have the same issue there with Imodane's Recruiter, where you need 3 mana to be able to use it, where oftentimes you won't have your 3rd land drop because that deck doesn't run a very high land count. So getting Goblin Bushwhacker as a way that we can buff our whole board for 2 mana is really big, and now that we have Goblin Bushwhacker and Ruby Collector, we now have a way higher chance of finding kind of like an alpha strike to give a huge attack after a Knight Errant Evios the following turn. So I feel like this card should be a really big buff to Boros Convoke, and that deck, I think the main reason why it's struggled to keep up in the current metagame is just a little bit of a lack of speed and a little bit of a lack of consistency, and I feel like Goblin Bushwhacker really kind of fills that role very well. So I'm very excited to try Convoke again, and I do feel like this is kind of like the exact card that deck was missing. So I wouldn't be surprised if Convoke is suddenly a good deck. I'm not sure it will quite be tier 1, but it will definitely be more viable again. Then in terms of Timeless, again, I think Bushwhacker is going to be at its best in a deck like Convoke, and I don't think you get any cards really moving from Historic to Timeless. So I'm not really sure this is likely to have a very big impact there, but I definitely think this is going to be a big one for Historic Convoke. Then next up we got Violent Outburst. So getting the 3 mana Cascaders is very, very interesting, because obviously these cards have been incredibly good in Modern in the past. Now, I don't think that Rhinos or, using these to cascade into Crashing Footfalls is going to be viable with only 1 3-mana Cascader. Until we get another card like a Shardless Agent, I don't think we have enough redundancy for that sort of effect for this deck to be good, really. But I do think one way you could use this is using Outburst to cascade into Up the Beanstalk, which is, what they were using in Modern for quite a while. Those sorts of decks actually ended up getting Up the Beanstalk banned. So I do think that it could be a viable way to use this card in Timeless. Use it to cascade into Beanstalk and then just, spam your pitch elementals. And the nice thing about that is it makes building around Up the Beanstalk a lot better, because you essentially have 8 copies in your main deck, potentially 12 if you want to run Bloodbraid Elf. I'm not sure I'm a massive fan of that personally, but it makes finding your first copy a lot more consistent. But more importantly, it also makes finding them in multiples a lot more consistent, which then enables kind of the combo aspect of the deck where you can essentially just draw through your whole deck in a single turn in a lot of situations, which is pretty interesting. Now, the big issue with that deck and just Beanstalk decks in general is that they have really, really polarizing matchups where you're incredibly good against the fair decks, but you really struggle against combo, which is an issue in Timeless right now when Show and Tell and Oars of Belcher are two of the best and most popular decks. So unless you can figure out a good sideboard plan for the combo decks, which isn't very easy to do, I have a suggestion of how to do that potentially in my article that's just gone up that I'll have a link down in the description, but even that I'm not 100% sure on. So I feel like, again, this is kind of like another variant of a way you could build the Beanstalk decks, but I feel like right now when combo is quite popular, I'm not sure that would be the best choice in the current metagame. Then in terms of Historic, again, like I said, I don't think you can really run this in Rhinos without another 3-mana Cascader. Unless, I guess you could run it with Bloodbraid Elf as well, but that's pretty slow. And then again, you could use this to cascade into up the Beanstalk there, but we don't really have the pitch elementals to enable the combo side of that. So I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't really do much in Historic, but I do think that this could birth a new way to build the Beanstalk deck in Timeless. Whether we can figure out a way to improve the combo matchups with that deck is yet to be seen, but it's definitely an interesting new addition. And if we do ever get another 3-mana Cascader, then Rhinos will be on the menu, which is a pretty interesting prospect. Then next up, we're getting an absolute classic. We're finally getting Dark Confidant on Arena, which is sick. But having said that, I think we've got to the point now where it's largely been power crept out of formats. Like in Modern, it hasn't seen play in ages. And this is, first of all, just going to see no play in Timeless whatsoever because it's a 2-1 and dies to Bowmasters. But I do think it could potentially see play in Historic. Now, having said that, low synergy mid-range decks haven't really been top tier in a while. I think Modern Horizons 3 really speeding up the proactive game plan of a lot of other decks makes it really difficult for these low synergy mid-range decks, because the only way these decks could win is if their early interaction lines up well, and all of the other linear decks speeding up makes that very difficult to do. But having said that, I do think, if you build the deck to the current metagame, you could have good matchups against decks like Boros Auras, which struggles against a lot of interaction. You can oftentimes make the control matchups good with a bunch of discard spells and generically powerful threats. You can, beat the sacrifice decks if you run a high number of Stone of Erec. Now, having said that, Mono Green Devotion is kind of like an unwinnable matchup a lot of the time for these kind of mid-range decks, and we already do have a ton of really good quality threats for mid-range decks, so I'm not even sure Dark Confidant would make the cut right now, but I'm definitely going to be trying it, and it could be another tool for these sorts of mid-range decks to work with. And like I said, if you build your interactive suite correctly, I do think you can beat a lot of the top tier decks in Historic right now. So not 100% sure if this is going to see play in Historic, but I'm definitely going to be trying it either way. And then next up, we're moving on to some of the more fringe stuff. So starting off here with Boros Charm. So this is obviously going to be a very nice addition to Burn decks. Now, having said that, Burn hasn't really been a factor in Historic or Timeless for a while. Specifically in Timeless, I'm not sure there's really too much incentive to go Boros over Rakdos. I think Rakdos gives you some pretty unique effects like discard spells against the combo decks and Bowmasters and stuff like that, but this is incentive to move into white, and I think specifically in Historic, Boros Burn has been a deck in the past, and this does seem like a card that sort of deck has been wanting for quite a while, so definitely going to be trying it there as well. And then additionally, one other card that we're getting that could slot into Burn is Boltwave. I think, traditionally the big issue with Burn is that you've struggled to have a high density of efficient burn spells, and Boltwave, the issue that I've got with this card is that I think in both formats you ideally want your burn spells to be targeting creatures as well. I think both formats have very prominent creature decks that burn. You really need to be taking out the opponent's creatures against decks like Energy, against decks like Auras, against decks like Sacrifice, for example. So having Boltwave only go face is a bit of an issue, but like I said, the big issue with Burn in the past has just been a lack of good efficient burn spells, and this just being essentially a lightning bolt that goes face and dodges stuff like Leyline of Sanctity is pretty nice. And if you are moving into Boros, you don't have stuff like Bump in the Night, so this could kind of act like a Bump in the Night for Boros as well. Now again, having said that, I don't think Burn is particularly well positioned in either format right now, so I don't expect these to have a huge impact. But if the format shifts and we get extra Burn cards in future, this is definitely one to consider. The next up we're getting Remand on Arena, which is obviously another fairly iconic card that we've seen play in older formats in the past. Now, having said that, we already have Reprieve on Arena, and a lot of decks that want to be running this sort of effect will be blue-white already, and Reprieve is just, I think it's basically strictly better than this because it can get around can't be countered effects, because it's not an actual counterspell itself. But you know, if you're running a blue deck that's not running white and you want this sort of effect, this is definitely one to consider. But I can't really think of any deck that this slots directly into. Just one to be on, you know, have on your radar if you are building. I think mainly tempo or combo decks would be more interested in this. And having said that, in Historic, we don't have great quality 2-mana counter spells, right? We do have No More Lies and Reprieve, but we don't have Mana Drain or Counterspell like we do in Timeless. So I think this is basically not going to see play ever in Timeless because of that. But if you're playing Historic and you are playing a tempo or a combo deck, and you're not playing white, this is definitely a card you could consider there. Then on a similar note, we've also got Condemn here, which is coming to Arena for the very first time. Now again, I don't think this is likely to see play in Timeless because we already have Swords to Plowshares there, but in Historic, if you are playing blue-white control, we don't have that many great options for cheap interaction. You've obviously got Fragment Reality, which is great on turn 1, but past that, if you're using it to take out bigger creatures, it's a 2-for-1 against you, which is always awkward. You obviously have Path to Exile as well, but that's very awkward to cast in the early game because you're ramping the opponent. So this is definitely another option if you do just want cheap interaction in blue-white control. Obviously comes with its own downsides, like the creature needs to be attacking, so if the opponent's getting value off the creature and not attacking with it, then it's awkward, but this is definitely an option to consider in Historic if you're playing blue-white control. Then next up we got Ivora Insatiable Heir, which is a card that I wanted to highlight. I'm not really sure this is going to see play, but I thought it was worth bringing up because I have recently been playing, or been working on some Vampire Reanimator decks in Historic. Now, this is not going to be good enough for Timeless. I'm not even sure this is going to be good enough for Historic, but having 1 toughness is kind of a death sentence for it in Timeless. But in Historic, I have been working on Vampire Reanimator, where you have Sorin plus Elenda and Vein Ripper, the full 4 copies of both to maximize your chances of assembling that. And then you also have a Reanimator aspect with Assemble from Parts as a way to reanimate your Vein Rippers and your Satan Elendas, so drawing them in multiples gives you some other way to use them. And the really nice thing about running that synergy with vampires and with Sorin is that the vampires like Voldaren Epicure and Bloodtithe Harvester provide you ways to loot your cards into the graveyard for your Reanimator package. They'll also provide you with other ways to utilize Sorin, right? You can obviously sacrifice your Epicures or buff them with the other Sorin abilities and then get value off Sorin that way. And Ivora Insatiable Heir gives you kind of an alternative to Bloodtithe Harvester. Now, I think in most matchups, Harvester is probably better because getting access to the interaction is pretty nice, but this is another 2-drop that gives you a blood token and can produce more blood tokens as the game goes on. If you are running interaction, like, you know, that deck that I was working on is kind of a mid-range deck with Fatal Push and Thoughtseize. Connecting with this can produce more blood tokens, which provides you with more card selection, more ways to loot your vampires into the graveyard, and it grows as you crack your blood tokens as well, so this could be worth considering specifically in that deck. I know it's quite a narrow application, but this is definitely a card that I'm going to be trying out there at the very least. But outside of that, I don't really expect it to have too much of an impact. Then next up we've got Sire of 7 Deaths, and again, I'm not really sure this is going to see play, but I thought it was worth highlighting because it's another Ugin's Labyrinth enabler, and I think specifically in Historic, Ugin's Labyrinth is quite an underplayed card, largely because the enablers aren't that great. I've recently been exploring the idea of a mono-green ramp deck running entirely basic forests, for, first of all, Utopia Sprawl, but second of all, for Traverse Valley, because if you go Forest, Traverse Valley, you guaranteed find an Ugin's Labyrinth the next turn because it's your only non-basic land in the deck. Then if you have a card you can imprint, you can then play Ugin's Labyrinth on turn 2 and immediately ramp to a 3-drop on turn 2. So it's a very consistent kind of system to be able to ramp to a 3-drop on turn 2, which is pretty interesting. And Sire of 7 Deaths, if you are just running a ramp deck, does seem like a payoff that's very difficult for a lot of decks to deal with, right? A lot of decks are really going to struggle to attack past this, especially if they're reliant on red-based removal to kill this. It's going to be a struggle. Now, having said that, the ward isn't that good, really. If it was more difficult for them to get around, like if it is ward sacrifice a creature or ward discard a card, I'd be more interested in this because, you know, I can see you ramping into this and then the Auras deck just getting a Sheltered by Ghost and being happy to pay the 7 life and then it just gets removed. So, again, not 100% sure on it, but I always think it's worth highlighting potentially playable 7 colorless cost cards, specifically because of Ugin's Labyrinth. Timeless, obviously, this is nowhere near good enough, and to be honest, I'm not really sure about it in Historic as well, but I wanted to highlight it. So those are all the cards that I wanted to highlight here, and while there weren't actually that many in terms of just the sheer numbers, I think the first ones that we talked about are very likely to have a big impact in their respective formats. I think the Artifact Enablers are going to have a very big impact in Historic, and I could potentially see that being a tier 1 deck again, which is a big deal. I think Balustrade Spy could be a very big deal in Timeless and potentially Historic as well. I think Priest of Gix could be a really nice buff to Jetstorm, which is already a decent deck in Timeless, and could also help make the deck more viable in Historic as well. I think Bushwhacker could push Convoke to being more towards a tier 1 deck in Historic as well, and then Outburst into Beanstalk could be a very interesting way to build that as well. So while there weren't as many cards to talk about in this set review, I think the few most high impact ones could have a very big impact, especially in Historic. Now, if there were any other cards from either of the sets that you think I missed, definitely let me know in the comments. Obviously, there was a very high density of cards between all 3 of the sets here, so it's not unlikely that I've missed something. So if you do think there's a card I missed, definitely let me know in the comments. And if you think there's an application of these cards that I also didn't talk about, definitely let me know in the comments as well. Either way, I'm so excited for this set to drop. Like I said, I've already got 6 decks pre-built that I've been working on a lot that I talk about in the MTG as in premium articles, so check that out if you're a premium member, and I can't wait to get my hands on these and finally test them. Either way, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.